The wedding night should have been hers. Instead, Lillian Vance stood alone in a marble corridor that echoed with absence, her white gown a mockery against the cold stone. Duke Adrian Blackthorne, her husband of exactly 4 hours, was gone. Not delayed, not called away on urgent business. Gone. Vanished like smoke, leaving behind nothing but whispers and a household that looked at her like she'd already died. But here's what they didn't know yet. The girl they left to rot in that castle wasn't going to break. She was going to disappear. And when she came back, she wouldn't be asking for anything. She'd be taking it all. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city name so I can see just how far this tale has traveled. The servants didn't meet her eyes. That was the first thing Lillian noticed when she woke the morning after her wedding, not the emptiness of the bed beside her. She'd already discovered that in the dark hours before dawn, one hand reaching across cold silk that had never been disturbed. Not the silence of the castle, which she'd expected from a place this vast and ancient, but the way the maid who brought her breakfast tray kept her gaze fixed somewhere around Lillian's collarbone, as if looking directly at her might turn the girl to stone. "Thank you," Lillian said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion sitting like lead in her chest. The maid bobbed a curtsy so quick it barely qualified and fled. Lillian sat at the small table by the window, looking out over grounds she didn't recognize. Blackthorne Castle sprawled across the countryside like something out of a Gothic novel. All dark stone and pointed towers, gardens that probably looked romantic in summer, but now, in late autumn, seemed skeletal. The trees were stripped bare. The sky was the color of old pewter. She picked at the toast. It was perfectly made, golden and buttered just right, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. Where is he? The question had consumed her since she'd woken alone. Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Blackthorne, 6th of his name, heir to one of the oldest fortunes in the country. The man who'd courted her with what she'd believed was genuine interest, who'd looked at her during the ceremony with something she'd mistaken for affection. He'd kissed her hand during the reception, smiled at her when the musicians played, led her to the castle after the guests departed, his hand warm on her lower back. And then, nothing. He'd excused himself. "Just a moment," he'd said. "There's something I need to attend to." She'd waited in the bedroom they were supposed to share, waited in her wedding dress until her back ached from the corset, finally changed into the nightgown that had been laid out by hands she'd never seen, feeling ridiculous and exposed. Waited some more. Eventually exhaustion had pulled her under, and she'd slept fitfully, startling awake every time the old building settled or the wind rattled the windows. He never came. A knock at the door made her jump. "Yes?" A different servant entered, older, female, with iron gray hair pulled back so severely it looked painful. "Mrs. Rothwell," the woman said by way of introduction. "Housekeeper." "Oh, good morning." Mrs. Rothwell's expression suggested there was nothing particularly good about it. "His Grace has left instructions that you are to be made comfortable. Anything you require, you need only ask." Lillian set down her toast. "I'd like to see him. I'm afraid that's not possible." "Why not?" "His Grace is unavailable." The word choice was deliberate. Not away, not occupied. Unavailable. As if Adrian were a resource that had been temporarily withdrawn from circulation. "When will he be available?" Lillian kept her voice level, but something hot was building behind her ribs. "I couldn't say, madam." "Is he in the castle?" A pause. "I couldn't say." "You couldn't say, or you won't say?" Mrs. Rothwell's face remained absolutely neutral. "Will there be anything else?" Lillian wanted to scream, wanted to demand answers, to insist on her rights as the Duke's wife, to throw the breakfast tray against the wall just to see if this woman's expression would finally crack. Instead, she said, "No, thank you." The housekeeper left. Lillian sat very still, hands folded in her lap, and tried to understand what was happening. The logical part of her brain, the part that had gotten her through the death of her parents, through the years living with her aunt who'd made it clear she was a burden, through the surprising whirlwind of Adrian's courtship, searched for reasonable explanations. An emergency. A business crisis. Some ducal responsibility she didn't understand yet, but the other part of her brain, the part that had learned to recognize when she wasn't wanted, whispered something darker. "He's done with you. Whatever this was, it's over." She spent the day exploring the castle, partly to orient herself and partly because sitting in that room was unbearable. Blackthorn was enormous, a maze of corridors and staircases, rooms that opened onto other rooms, galleries hung with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. She passed servants who pressed themselves against walls to let her by, who murmured, "Your Grace," without meeting her eyes. The title felt like a costume that didn't fit. In the library, a massive space that smelled of old leather and wood polish, she found herself staring at a portrait above the mantel. Adrian, clearly, though painted several years ago. Younger, maybe 20, with the same sharp features and dark eyes, but something softer in his expression. He stood with one hand resting on a stack of books, looking off to the side as if his attention had been caught by something more interesting than the painter. She'd fallen in love with him, she realized. Not deeply, not the kind of love poets wrote about, but enough. Enough to believe the marriage would be real. Enough to imagine a life together, companionship, if not passion. He'd seemed kind during their courtship, attentive. He'd asked her questions about herself, actually listened to the answers. After years of being invisible in her aunt's household, that attention had felt like sunlight. "Stupid," she whispered to the portrait. That night she insisted on dining in the formal dining room rather than her quarters. If she was going to be ignored, she'd at least do it in style. A servant set one place at the end of a table that could seat 40. The food was excellent. She ate mechanically, the clink of her silverware against china, the only sound except for the crackle of the fire. Halfway through the meal, footsteps in the corridor outside made her heart jump. She set down her fork, straightened in her chair, prepared to finally confront her absent husband. The footsteps passed by without slowing. She finished her dinner, went back to her room, dismissed the maid who tried to help her undress because she couldn't stand the pity in the girl's downcast eyes. Lay in bed staring at the canopy overhead, which was decorated with embroidered vines that looked like they were strangling each other. What did I do wrong? The question circled her thoughts like a vulture. She replayed every interaction with Adrian, searching for the moment she'd failed some test she hadn't known she was taking. Had she been too eager, too reserved, said something during the wedding that offended him? She'd been careful, so careful, to be exactly what she thought he wanted. Pleasant, agreeable, moderately intelligent, but not threatening, pretty, but not vain. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe he'd realized he'd married a collection of carefully crafted behaviors rather than a real person. Or maybe, and this thought hurt worse, he'd never cared who she was at all. The days blurred together. Adrian didn't return. No one would tell her where he'd gone or when he'd be back, or if he'd left any message for her. Lillian established a routine because the alternative was sitting in her room going quietly insane. Breakfast alone, a walk through the gardens despite the cold, reading in the library, dinner alone, bed. She spoke to no one except servants, and those conversations were brief and rigidly formal. The castle staff treated her like a peculiar piece of furniture, necessary to maintain, but not particularly interesting. On the 5th day, she found a newspaper in the library that someone had left on a side table. She almost didn't pick it up. What did the outside world matter when her own world had shrunk to these walls? But boredom won. She scanned the society pages, not sure what she was looking for. And there it was, a small item, easily missed. The Duke of Blackthorn was seen at Lady Pemberton's gathering last evening, though notably without his new bride. Sources say the Duchess is indisposed at the country estate. One does hope the newlyweds aren't spending too much time apart so early in the marriage. The newspaper crumpled in her fist. He was in London, at parties, while she rotted here like a prisoner. The hot thing that had been building in her chest since that first morning finally broke through. Lillian stood, walked calmly to the nearest wall, and drove her fist into it. Pain exploded across her knuckles. She hit it again, until the skin split and blood welled up, until the physical hurt was enough to drown out everything else. "Madam!" Mrs. Rothwell appeared from nowhere, eyes wide, the first real emotion Lillian had seen from her. The housekeeper grabbed her wrist. "What are you doing?" "Getting his attention," Lillian said. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Does he even know I'm here? Does anyone tell him what happens in this house?" "You're bleeding. Come, we need to bandage this. Answer me." Mrs. Rothwell's expression shifted into something complicated. Pity mixed with frustration mixed with something that might have been respect. "His Grace receives reports." Reports. Lillian laughed, sharp and bitter. So I'm a line item now? The Duchess remains alive? Continue to feed her? No action required? Let me tend your hand. Lillian let herself be led to a nearby chair. Mrs. Rothwell disappeared and returned with a first aid kit, cleaning the wounds with efficient movements that suggested she'd dealt with worse. As she worked, Lillian studied the woman's face, looking for cracks in the armor. How long? She asked quietly. How long what, madam? How long has he done this? I can't be the first person he's discarded. Mrs. Rothwell's hand stilled for just a moment. You're the first he's married. Lucky me. The Duke is complicated. That's a generous word for it. The housekeeper finished wrapping the bandage neat and tight. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. It's not my place to speak of His Grace's affairs. But you're going to anyway. It wasn't a question. Lillian had heard that particular tone before. The hesitation before someone said something they knew they shouldn't. Mrs. Rothwell stood, gathering up the bloodied cloths. There are things in this house that aren't right. Haven't been right for a long time. The Duke has his reasons for what he does, though whether they're good reasons is between him and his conscience. That's cryptic as hell. It's all I can offer. After she left, Lillian sat in the darkening library, cradling her bandaged hand. Things that aren't right. Reasons. All of it adding up to exactly nothing useful. That night, she made a decision. She couldn't leave. She had nowhere to go, no money of her own, no family that would take her back without judgment. Her aunt had made it clear that marrying the Duke was Lillian's one chance at security, and squandering it would not be forgiven. So leaving wasn't an option. But staying like this, passive and pathetic, waiting for a man who clearly had no intention of being a husband, that wasn't an option either. If Adrian Blackthorne wanted to abandon her in this castle, fine. But she wasn't going to waste away in the process. This house held power, old power, the kind that came with money and title and centuries of accumulated influence. If she was going to be trapped here, she'd at least understand the cage. The next morning, Lillian requested a meeting with the estate manager. A man named Thornton appeared, middle-aged and precise, clearly uncomfortable with the summons. Your Grace. He bowed slightly. How may I assist you? I'd like to understand how the estate operates. The finances, the properties, the investments, everything. Thornton blinked. I'm afraid those matters are managed by His Grace. His Grace isn't here. I am. Nevertheless, I don't have the authority to share. I'm the Duchess. She said it firmly, drawing on every scrap of authority the title might carry. These are family matters. Unless you're suggesting I have no place in this family. A long pause. Thornton's expression suggested he was doing exactly that calculation. Displease the absent Duke or displease the present Duchess? Perhaps a general overview would be appropriate, he said carefully. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. Lillian spent the next 3 hours listening to Thornton explain the Blackthorne holdings, properties across 3 counties, investments in railways and shipping, agricultural lands that generated steady income. The Duke was, she learned, spectacularly wealthy. Not just rich, wealthy in the way that meant he could probably buy a small country if he got bored, and she was entitled to exactly none of it, beyond her allowance and the roof over her head. What about the Duchess's portion? She asked. Thornton looked confused. The portion? My marriage settlement, what I have independent control over. Ah. He shuffled papers, not meeting her eyes. The marriage contract specified that your dowry would be absorbed into the general estate funds. In exchange, you receive an annual allowance for personal expenses, and of course all necessities are provided. How much is the allowance? He named a figure that would have seemed generous when she was living with her aunt. Now, understanding the scale of the Blackthorne fortune, it was insulting, pin money, an afterthought. I see, she said quietly. Thank you, Mr. Thornton. This has been very educational. After he left, Lillian sat at the desk where he'd spread the ledgers and documents, staring at columns of numbers that represented more money than she could properly imagine. Adrian had made sure she'd have no financial independence. Whether that was standard practice or deliberate strategy, the effect was the same. She was completely dependent on his goodwill, and he'd demonstrated exactly how much goodwill he had. The weeks crawled by. Lillian continued her education, requesting meetings with various people who managed different aspects of the estate. The head gardener explained the grounds. The stable master discussed the horses. The cook, a formidable woman named Mrs. Chen, walked her through the kitchen operations with the air of someone humoring a child's curiosity. Everyone was polite, professional, and utterly unwilling to acknowledge that the situation was insane. She started keeping notes, not just about the estate operations, but about everything. The relationships between servants, who held real power versus who held titles, where the money actually flowed. She'd spent years being invisible in her aunt's household, and she'd learned that invisible people saw things others missed. The castle, she discovered, ran like a small government. Mrs. Rothwell was the real power, managing everything from staff conflicts to supply orders. Thornton handled the money, but deferred to the housekeeper on practical matters. There was a complex hierarchy below them, senior servants who'd been with the family for decades, newer staff who were still finding their place, everyone jockeying for position and security. And above it all, the absent Duke, whose word was law, but who never seemed to actually issue any words. Lillian began to understand something. Blackthorn Castle didn't need Adrian to function. It had been running itself for generations, a machine so well built that its owner was effectively irrelevant to daily operations. He could disappear for weeks, months maybe, and nothing would change except the servants would have one less person to dress and feed. The realization was oddly freeing. 2 months after the wedding, a letter arrived. Lillian found it on the breakfast tray, her name written in an elegant hand she didn't recognize. She turned it over. The seal was unfamiliar, not the Blackthorn crest. Inside, the message was brief. Duchess Blackthorn, we regret to inform you that your presence is required at the Haversham trial. You will be called as a character witness. Transportation will be arranged. Expect departure in 3 days. It was signed by a solicitor she'd never heard of. Lillian read it 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Haversham trial? She didn't know anyone named Haversham. Character witness for what? She sent for Mrs. Rothwell, who appeared with her usual efficiency. Do you know anything about this? Lillian held up the letter. The housekeeper's face went carefully blank. No, madam. There's a trial. Someone wants me to testify. I'm sure His Grace will handle it. His Grace isn't here. Lillian's patience, already worn thin, snapped. For God's sake, does anyone in this house understand that? He's not here. He hasn't been here for 2 months. Whatever's happening, I'm the only Blackthorn available to deal with it. Mrs. Rothwell's lips pressed into a thin line. I wouldn't recommend involving yourself in legal matters. Why not? What's this about? I don't know the details. But you know something. Silence. Mrs. Rothwell, I'm asking you directly, what is the Haversham trial? The housekeeper drew a slow breath. When she spoke, her voice was quieter. Lord Haversham is being tried for fraud. He was a business associate of His Grace's. There are allegations that the Duke may have been aware of certain irregularities. The room suddenly felt colder. They think Adrian was involved in fraud? I don't know what they think, madam. I only know what the staff hears. Lillian looked down at the letter again. Character witness. They wanted her to vouch for Adrian's integrity, his honesty, his moral character. The man who'd married her and vanished the same night. She almost laughed. I'll need appropriate clothing for a court appearance, she said. And I want all the documentation we have about Adrian's business relationship with Lord Haversham. Madam, now please. Mrs. Rothwell hesitated, then nodded and left. Lillian spent the next 3 days preparing. Thornton, clearly uncomfortable, provided financial records showing Adrian's investments with Haversham, substantial amounts in what appeared to be legitimate shipping ventures. There were letters, contracts, meeting notes. All of it looked normal on the surface. But Lillian had been studying how money worked in this world, and she noticed things. Dates that didn't quite line up, payments that seemed too large or too small, references to meetings that weren't recorded elsewhere. Either Adrian had been careless or he'd been deliberately hiding something. The carriage that came for her was expensive but unmarked. The driver barely spoke. They traveled for 6 hours, arriving at a courthouse in a city she'd never visited. A clerk met her at the entrance, led her to a private room, explained in clinical terms what would happen. You'll be asked about the Duke's character, his business practices. whether you observed anything that suggested improper conduct. I've known him for 3 months, Lillian said, 2 of which he's been absent. The clerk's expression suggested this was not helpful. Do your best. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, paneled in dark wood that absorbed the light from high windows. Lord Haversham sat at a table with his lawyers, a thin man with nervous hands and eyes that wouldn't settle on anything for more than a second. The prosecution sat opposite, stern and organized. Lillian was sworn in, told to state her name and relationship to the Duke. The prosecutor stood. Duchess Blackthorne, how would you characterize your husband's approach to business? I wouldn't know. He's never discussed business with me. In your time with the Duke, did you observe any behavior that suggested dishonesty? She thought about the wedding night, the abandonment, the complete absence of explanation or apology. Yes, she said. The courtroom went very quiet. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly. Could you elaborate? He's dishonest about his intentions. He presents himself as one thing and acts as another. Whether that extends to his business practices, I couldn't say, but character-wise, he's proven himself unreliable. Your Grace, the judge interrupted, please confine your answers to relevant matters. You asked about dishonesty. I'm telling you what I've observed. The defense attorney was on his feet. Objection! The witness is clearly biased and— I'm his wife, Lillian cut in. If anyone should be biased in his favor, it's me. But I won't lie under oath just to protect a man who hasn't extended me the same courtesy. The judge banged his gavel. That's enough. The witness will answer only the questions asked. But the damage was done. Lillian could see it in the way the jury members looked at each other, the whispers that started in the gallery. She'd just publicly humiliated the Duke of Blackthorne, in front of lawyers, journalists, half the aristocracy that had nothing better to do than attend scandalous trials. The rest of her testimony was brief and useless. She genuinely knew nothing about Adrian's business with Haversham. After 15 minutes, she was dismissed. As she left the stand, she caught Lord Haversham's expression, a mixture of surprise and calculation. And in the back of the courtroom, partially hidden by a column, she saw someone she recognized. Adrian. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not anger, though she'd expected that. Something more complex. Almost impressed? Their eyes met for 3 seconds. Then he turned and disappeared through a side door before she could react. Lillian stood frozen in the aisle, her heart hammering. He'd been there. Had probably been there the whole time, listening to her eviscerate his character in front of everyone who mattered in his world. And he'd just left. The carriage ride back to Blackthorne was a blur. Lillian stared out the window, watching countryside roll past, trying to process what had happened. She'd just destroyed whatever small chance she'd had of salvaging this marriage. Adrian would never forgive the public humiliation. But underneath the fear was something else, something that felt dangerously like satisfaction. She'd spent 2 months being powerless, invisible, trapped. And in one testimony, she'd reminded everyone, including herself, that she still had a voice, still had agency, even if it was just the ability to tell the truth when asked. It was dark when they arrived back at the castle. Mrs. Rothwell met her at the door, face tight with disapproval. His Grace has requested you meet him in his study. So he'd come back. Of course he had. Couldn't let her humiliation of him go unanswered. Lillian handed her coat to a servant. Lead the way. The study was on the 2nd floor, down a corridor she'd only explored once. Mrs. Rothwell knocked, opened the door, and stepped aside. Adrian stood by the fireplace, still in the clothes he'd worn to court. He looked tired, actually tired, not the fashionable ennui that aristocrats cultivated. There were shadows under his eyes, lines around his mouth that she didn't remember from the wedding. Close the door, he said. She did, then stood with her back to it, waiting. Adrian studied her for a long moment. That was quite a performance today. It wasn't a performance, it was testimony under oath. You could have lied. I could have, I didn't. Why not? The question seemed genuine, which somehow made it worse. Lillian crossed her arms. You want me to explain why I told the truth? That's what we're doing here? I want to understand what you thought you'd accomplish. I wasn't trying to accomplish anything. Someone asked me a question, and I answered it honestly. If that's a revolutionary concept in your world, I apologize for the confusion. Adrian's jaw tightened. You made me look like a villain. I made you look like what you are. The words came out harder than she'd intended, but she didn't take them back. You married me, Adrian, promised things, at least implicitly, and then you vanished. For 2 months I've been living in this house like a ghost, with no explanation, no contact, no acknowledgement that I even exist except as a line item in your household accounts. So yes, when asked if you're dishonest, I said yes, because you are. You don't understand the situation. Then explain it. She heard her voice rising and didn't care. Explain why you left. Explain why you've avoided me. Explain why I had to find out you were in London from a goddamn newspaper. Explain any of it. Because I have been trying to figure out what I did wrong for 2 months, and I'm starting to think the answer is nothing. I did nothing wrong. You just never wanted a wife in the first place. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. When Adrian finally spoke, his voice was quiet. I was protecting you. From what? From exactly what happened today. From being associated with my business, my problems. The Haversham situation has been developing for months. I knew it would end in scandal, possibly criminal charges. I didn't want you anywhere near it. Lillian stared at him. So your solution was to marry me and immediately disappear. How does that make sense? The marriage was necessary for other reasons. What reasons? Political ones? Family ones? Complicated? Try me. I'm smarter than you apparently think. His expression shifted, something almost like regret crossing his features. My grandfather's will stipulated that I had to be married by 30 to maintain full control of the estate. There were other claimants, cousins who would have contested my position if I remained single. The marriage secured my inheritance. The words hit her like cold water. So I was insurance, a legal formality. It's not that simple. It sounds exactly that simple. You needed a wife on paper. You found someone desperate enough, someone with no family to make trouble, no resources to fight back, and you married her just long enough to satisfy the terms of the will. Then you fucked off to handle your real life while I rotted here. Lillian, don't. She held up her bandaged hand. Don't say my name like we're familiar. You gave up that right when you walked away on our wedding night. Adrian's hands clenched at his sides. For a moment she thought he might actually apologize, might show some genuine remorse. Instead he said, "The trial will likely conclude in Haversham's favor. Your testimony complicated things, but it won't change the outcome. I'll make sure you're not called again." How generous. After this settles, we'll discuss arrangements. Arrangements. Living separately. Maintaining the marriage legally, but pursuing independent lives. It's not uncommon among people of our class. Lillian laughed, short and sharp. You're describing our current situation, except now I know it's permanent. It's practical. It's pathetic. She moved toward the door, done with this conversation, done with him. But sure, Adrian, let's be practical. You stay in your world, I'll stay in mine, and we can both pretend this disaster never happened. Lillian. She stopped, hand on the doorknob, not turning around. I am sorry. For what it's worth. It's worth nothing, she said, and left. Back in her room, Lillian dismissed the maid and sat at the window, looking out over the dark grounds. Her reflection stared back from the glass, pale, angry, still wearing the severe dress she'd worn to court. She'd been wrong earlier. She wasn't a pawn. She was a signature on a document, a box checked, a legal requirement satisfied. And the worst part was that she'd let herself hope, even just a little, that there was more to it. That Adrian's courtship had meant something. That the marriage could become real. That she mattered beyond her utility. Stupid. So stupid. But as she sat there, the anger started to crystallize into something colder and more useful. Adrian thought he could use her and discard her. Thought she'd just accept whatever scraps of life he was willing to allow. He was wrong. She'd spent 2 months learning how this world worked. The money, the power structures, the unspoken rules. She'd started as an observer because she had no other choice. But observation had taught her things, shown her leverage points she hadn't known existed. If she was going to be trapped in this marriage, trapped in this castle, trapped in this life she hadn't chosen, fine. But she wasn't going to be passive anymore. Lillian pulled out the notebook where she'd been keeping her observations, flipped to a blank page, started writing, not notes this time, a plan. The plan started small, deliberately so. Lillian knew better than to storm the gates. She'd watched enough servants navigate the castle's power structures to understand that direct confrontation rarely worked. The people who got things done here were the ones who moved carefully, who built alliances, who understood that information was currency. So she started collecting. Every morning, she reviewed the household accounts that Thornton reluctantly provided. Not just the summary sheets, but the detailed ledgers showing every purchase, every payment, every transaction. She memorized vendor names, noticed patterns in spending, flagged inconsistencies. When she had questions, she asked them casually, as if she were simply curious rather than building a comprehensive understanding of how money moved through Blackthorn. Thornton grew increasingly uncomfortable with her interest, but he couldn't refuse without openly admitting that the Duchess had no right to understand her own household. So he answered, though his answers became progressively more evasive. "The payment to Ashford & Sons seems unusually large for landscaping," Lillian said one morning, pointing to a line item. "They handle specialized work." "What kind of specialized work?" "Ornamental hedges, topiary, that sort of thing." "For £800? Thornton shifted in his seat. "The gardens are extensive, Your Grace." She made a note, moved on. Let him think she'd accepted the explanation. Later, she asked the head gardener about Ashford & Sons. The man looked blank. "Never heard of them, Your Grace. We handle most of the work ourselves, and when we need extra hands, we hire from the village." "What about ornamental hedges?" He laughed. "We keep things simple here. His Grace prefers a natural look." She thanked him and walked away, adding another piece to the puzzle forming in her mind. £800, supposedly for gardening that never happened. The money was going somewhere, just not where the ledgers claimed. There were other discrepancies. A monthly payment to a consulting firm that nobody could explain. Expenses for household repairs that the maintenance staff knew nothing about. Small amounts. Individually insignificant, but they added up. Someone was skimming from the estate, had probably been doing it for years, confident that an absentee duke and a powerless duchess would never notice. Lillian suspected Thornton, but she couldn't prove it yet, and confronting him without proof would only drive the operation deeper underground. So she kept watching, kept taking notes, and started talking to the servants. Not interrogating them, that would have raised immediate suspicion, just casual conversations, asking the cook about her favorite recipes, complimenting the maids on their work, chatting with the stable master about the horses, building relationships, becoming less of a ghost and more of a person. Mrs. Rothwell noticed, of course. The housekeeper didn't miss much. "You're spending a lot of time below stairs," she observed one afternoon. "I'm bored," Lillian said truthfully. "And everyone up here acts like I'm made of glass. At least the kitchen staff will have a normal conversation." "It's not appropriate for the Duchess to—" "To what? Talk to the people who run my household? Mrs. Rothwell, I understand there are protocols, but I'm not interested in being appropriate. I'm interested in not going insane from isolation." The housekeeper's expression softened, just slightly. "I suppose there's no harm in it. Actually, there was considerable harm in it if you were someone who preferred the Duchess to remain ignorant and powerless." But Mrs. Rothwell didn't seem to realize that yet. Through those conversations, Lillian learned things. She learned that the previous housekeeper had been dismissed suddenly 3 years ago, right before Thornton was hired. That several senior servants had left around the same time, replaced by people with no family connections to the area. That the Duke's visits to Blackthorn had become increasingly rare over the past decade, even before his marriage. She learned that Adrian had a younger sister who died 10 years ago, though nobody would talk about how or why. That his father had been a gambler who'd nearly destroyed the family fortune before his own death. That the current Duke had spent his 20s rebuilding everything his father had wrecked, working obsessively, trusting almost no one. The picture that emerged was complicated. Adrian wasn't just a careless aristocrat amusing himself while his wife suffered. He was damaged, paranoid, locked in some kind of ongoing struggle that extended far beyond a fraudulent business partner. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it made it make more sense. 3 weeks after the trial, a letter arrived from Adrian's solicitor. Lillian opened it in the library, half expecting divorce papers. Instead, it was a financial arrangement. Her annual allowance was being increased, substantially. In addition, she would receive a quarterly disbursement into an account in her name, with no restrictions on how she spent it. The letter was clinical, professional, and absolutely devoid of any personal message from Adrian himself. Lillian set it down, feeling something twist in her chest. This was his apology, apparently. Money. As if that fixed anything. But even as she thought it, the practical part of her brain was calculating. The quarterly amount was significant, enough to achieve real independence if she was smart about it, enough to disappear if she wanted to. The thought struck her like lightning. She could leave. Not run away in desperation, the way she'd imagined in her darkest moments, but actually, legitimately leave. With money, with planning, with a strategy for building a life beyond these walls. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Lillian spent the next month researching. The castle library had newspapers from London, business journals, society magazines. She read everything, absorbing information about investments, property markets, business opportunities. She wrote to her former governess, one of the few people from her old life who'd shown her genuine kindness, asking casual questions about London neighborhoods, living costs, professional opportunities for women. The responses were illuminating. London was expensive, but not impossibly so. There were boarding houses that catered to respectable women, businesses that hired female clerks and typists, even a few female-owned enterprises in publishing and fashion. It wasn't easy. Women operating independently faced constant scrutiny and suspicion, but it was possible. She began making plans in earnest. The first problem was identity. She couldn't exactly show up in London as the Duchess of Blackthorn without causing immediate scandal. She needed to be someone else, someone unremarkable enough to disappear into city life. Going through her mother's old papers, which she'd kept in a trunk, Lillian found what she needed. Her mother had a cousin who'd emigrated to America 20 years ago, a woman named Eleanor Marsh who'd have no reason to return to England. Lillian didn't look particularly like Eleanor based on the old photographs, but they had similar coloring, and it had been 2 decades. With the right story, it could work. The second problem was logistics. She needed to move money without triggering suspicion, establish herself somewhere before anyone realized she was gone. Create enough confusion about her whereabouts that it would take time to track her down. She started small. Purchased items through mail order and had them shipped to a boarding house in London, using the name Eleanor Marsh. Opened a bank account in that name at a small branch where nobody would recognize her. Transferred funds slowly, carefully, making sure each transaction looked legitimate. It took 3 months of preparation. 3 months of playing the dutiful Duchess by day while building an escape route by night. And through it all, Adrian never visited, never wrote except through his solicitor, never showed the slightest interest in what she was doing. Perfect. The night before her planned departure, Mrs. Rothwell knocked on her door. "There's someone here to see you, Your Grace." Lillian's heart jumped. "Adrian?" "No, madam, a woman. She says it's urgent." That was strange. Lillian received no visitors, had no friends in the area, no social connections to speak of. Did she give a name? "Lady Catherine Sterling." The name meant nothing. "Show her to the drawing room. I'll be down shortly." She changed quickly, pulled her composure around herself like armor, and descended the stairs. The drawing room was one of the formal spaces she rarely used, decorated in blues and golds that had probably been fashionable 50 years ago. The woman waiting there was around 40, dressed in expensive but understated clothes, with sharp eyes that took in everything. She stood when Lillian entered. "Duchess Blackthorn, thank you for seeing me." "Lady Sterling, I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage. I don't believe we've met." "We haven't. I'm here on behalf of someone who prefers to remain anonymous for the moment." Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. "That sounds ominous." "It's merely cautious." Catherine gestured to the chairs. "May we sit?" They did, and Catherine wasted no time. "I'll be direct. You've been making preparations to leave. Bank accounts, mail arrangements, identity building. You're planning to disappear." Lillian's blood went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please, I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to help." "Why would you help me?" "Because the person I represent has an interest in seeing the Duke of Blackthorn lose his carefully maintained control, and your disappearance would accomplish that beautifully." "Who are you working for?" Catherine smiled. "Let's call them a concerned party with a long memory and deep pockets. Someone who believes Adrian Blackthorn has gotten away with too much for too long. You want revenge. We want justice. There's a difference." Lillian studied the woman, trying to read her intentions. Everything about this screamed danger. Unknown benefactors, secret agendas, manipulation disguised as assistance. Even if what you're suggesting were true, she said carefully, why would I trust you? Because you're about to make several critical mistakes that will get you caught within a week of leaving. Catherine pulled a folder from her bag. The boarding house you've been using? It's owned by a man who does occasional work for the Duke's investigators. Your bank account? Small branch, yes, but the manager is cousins with Thornton. The name Eleanor Marsh? Your mother's cousin returned to England 6 months ago and is currently living in Brighton. Lillian felt sick. Every precaution she'd taken, every careful step, all of it compromised. How do you know all this? I make it my business to know things, and if I could find these problems, so could anyone Adrian hires to track you down. Catherine leaned forward. But I can fix them. New identity with a complete backstory, verified documents, a network of safe contacts in London, housing that's actually secure, financial arrangements that can't be traced. Everything you need to disappear properly. In exchange for what? Information, testimony if it comes to that, about what you've observed in this house, the Duke's business practices, anything that might be useful in building a legal case against him. You want me to betray my husband? I want you to tell the truth about a man who's been lying to you since the day you met him. Catherine's voice hardened. He married you for paperwork, Lillian, used you like a stamp on a document. You owe him nothing. She wasn't wrong, but something about this felt wrong anyway. I need time to think about it. You don't have time. Your plan was to leave tomorrow night, yes? Wait any longer and you'll miss your window. The quarterly disbursement hits your account in 2 days, and Thornton will be watching for unusual activity. It's now or never. Lillian stood, paced to the window. Outside, the grounds were dark, the gardens invisible except where moonlight caught on stone pathways. She'd been so careful, so sure she'd covered her tracks. And apparently she'd been obvious as hell to anyone paying attention. If I agree, she said slowly, I want guarantees, written contracts, legal protections. You'll have them. And I want to know who I'm working for. No anonymous benefactors. I need a name. Catherine hesitated. That's not my decision to make. Then get permission, because I'm not jumping into this blind. They stared at each other, the air thick with tension. Finally, Catherine pulled out a phone, stepped away, spoke in low tones that Lillian couldn't quite hear. When she returned, her expression was resigned. Lord Edmund Ashford. He was Adrian's uncle by marriage. The Duke destroyed his shipping business 15 years ago through what Edmund believes was calculated fraud and manipulation. He spent the last decade rebuilding and waiting for an opportunity to return the favor. Ashford, the name from the fake landscaping expenses. Is he skimming from the estate? Edmund? No, but he knows who is, and he's been protecting them in exchange for information about Adrian's activities. Jesus. Lillian sat back down, processing. This wasn't just about her escape. She'd stumbled into the middle of a war that had been going on for years, with players and grudges she didn't understand. I need to meet him before I agree to anything. That can be arranged, but Lillian, we really are running out of time. If you're going to do this, decide, now. Every instinct screamed danger. This was too complicated, too many unknown variables, too much that could go catastrophically wrong. But staying was impossible. Her carefully built plan was apparently garbage, and going alone without help meant she'd be found within days and dragged back to live out the rest of her life as a failed runaway. Tomorrow night, she said. Get me to London, set up the meeting with Ashford, and I'll hear him out. After that, I'll decide whether to help. Catherine smiled. Smart. There's a carriage that parks near the East Garden Gate every Thursday around midnight. Looks like a merchant wagon. The driver's name is Marcus. He'll get you out. How do you know about the merchant wagons? Lillian, I know everything about this place. She stood, gathering her things. Pack light. Bring nothing that's distinctly tied to the Duchess. And don't tell anyone, not even the servants you've befriended. Trust no one here. After Catherine left, Lillian sat in the drawing room for a long time, staring at nothing. She'd been planning an escape. Now she was planning something closer to defection. The next day dragged endlessly. Lillian went through her normal routine, hyper-aware of every interaction, looking for signs that someone knew. But the castle operated as it always did, smooth, professional, utterly indifferent to her internal crisis. She spent the afternoon sorting through her possessions, choosing what to take. It was harder than expected. Most of her things were from her life before the marriage, cheap, worn, markers of the poverty she'd tried to leave behind. The expensive clothes and jewelry Adrian had provided felt like lies she didn't want to carry. In the end, she packed one bag. Practical clothes, a few books, her mother's letters, the notebook where she'd recorded everything she'd learned about Blackthorn. Everything else she left. At 11 that night, she changed into the plainest dress she owned, pulled a dark cloak over it, and waited. Her room was in the west wing, far from the east garden. She'd have to cross most of the castle without being seen. At 11:30, she opened her door and listened. Silence. The servants would be finishing their evening duties, the senior staff in their own quarters. She moved quickly through the corridors, keeping to the shadows, freezing twice when she heard footsteps that turned out to be nothing. The East Garden Gate was a servant's entrance, rarely used. Lillian had walked past it a dozen times during her explorations, never thinking it would become her escape route. She reached it at 11:50. Slipped outside into air that bit with autumn cold. The garden was overgrown here, wilder than the manicured sections near the main house. And there, just visible beyond the gate, a wagon. Plain, unmarked, pulled by two horses that stood patiently in the dark. A man sat on the driver's bench, Marcus presumably. He saw her and nodded, climbing down to open the back. Lillian took 3 steps toward freedom. Going somewhere? She spun around. Mrs. Rothwell stood in the doorway, fully dressed despite the late hour, her expression unreadable. Lillian's mind raced. Lie? Confess? Run? "I'm leaving," she said finally. No point in pretense. "I can see that." The housekeeper stepped closer. In the middle of the night, with a stranger's wagon, very dignified. "I don't care about dignity anymore." Clearly, Mrs. Rothwell looked at the wagon, then back at Lillian. "Did you think no one would notice the Duchess disappearing? I thought I'd be gone before anyone cared enough to check." Something flickered across the older woman's face. "You really believe that, don't you? That you don't matter here?" "I know I don't matter here." "You're wrong." Mrs. Rothwell's voice was quiet. "But I suppose we gave you no reason to think otherwise." They stood in tense silence. The wagon driver shifted nervously. Then Mrs. Rothwell did something completely unexpected. She stepped aside. "Go," she said, "before I change my mind." Lillian stared at her. "What?" "This house has been a prison for too many people for too long. If you found a way out, take it." The housekeeper's expression hardened. "But understand this. Once you leave, you can't come back. Not as the Duchess. Whatever happens next, that life is over." "I know." "Then go. Quickly." Lillian wanted to ask why, wanted to understand this sudden mercy, but the wagon driver was gesturing urgently. She ran to the wagon, climbed into the back where supplies created a small hidden space, and pulled the canvas cover over herself. The wagon lurched into motion. Through a gap in the canvas, she caught one last glimpse of Mrs. Rothwell, standing alone in the garden entrance, watching her disappear into the night. The journey to London took 14 hours, and every one of them felt like it might be her last as a free woman. Lillian huddled in the hidden compartment of the wagon, surrounded by crates that smelled of hay and something vaguely chemical. The space was barely large enough for her to sit with her knees drawn up, and after the first few hours, her legs cramped so badly she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. The wagon hit every pothole, every rut in the road, jolting her against the wooden boards until she was sure she'd be covered in bruises. Marcus never spoke to her except once, when they stopped to change horses around dawn. He opened the canvas just enough to pass through bread and water. "We're being followed," he said quietly. "2 riders, staying back but definitely tracking us. Could be coincidence." "But you don't think it is?" "No, ma'am." Her stomach dropped. "What do we do?" "I know some routes. We'll lose them." He didn't sound entirely convinced. The canvas dropped back into place before she could ask more questions. The next hours were worse. The wagon picked up speed, turning onto rougher roads that made the earlier discomfort seem pleasant by comparison. Lillian gripped the edges of the crates, trying not to be thrown around too violently, her mind spinning through possibilities. Had Mrs. Rothwell betrayed her after all? Had someone else seen her leave? Or had Adrian been watching more closely than anyone realized? When they finally stopped moving, it was full dark again. Lillian's entire body ached, and when Marcus pulled back the canvas, she could barely uncurl herself enough to climb out. They were in a narrow alley between buildings that pressed in on both sides. The smell of the city hit her immediately. Coal smoke, sewage, too many people packed too close together. London. It had to be. Lost them about 2 hours ago, Marcus said, helping her down. Her legs nearly buckled. Took the long way just to be sure. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Lady Catherine will meet you at the boarding house. 3 streets over, blue door, ask for Mrs. Henley. He handed her the small bag she'd packed. And ma'am, whatever you're running from, I hope you make it. He left before she could respond, the wagon disappearing into the maze of alleys. Lillian stood alone in the London night in a part of the city she didn't recognize, wearing clothes that marked her as neither wealthy nor truly poor, just lost. She clutched her bag and tried to remember Catherine's instructions. 3 streets over, blue door. She found it eventually, after 2 wrong turns and 1 encounter with a drunk man who'd stared at her too long before wandering away. The boarding house was narrow and tired-looking, paint peeling from the doorframe. But the woman who answered her knock had kind eyes. Mrs. Henley? That's right, dear. You must be the one Lady Catherine mentioned. Come in, come in. The interior was cleaner than the exterior suggested. A narrow hallway, stairs leading up, the smell of cooking from somewhere in the back. Mrs. Henley led her to a small room on the 2nd floor, just a bed, a washstand, a single chair, but it was warm and private. Lady Catherine said to tell you she'd be by in the morning. There's water for washing, and I'll bring up some supper in a bit. Thank you, Lillian's voice cracked. The kindness was almost harder to bear than the cruelty had been. Thank you. After Mrs. Henley left, Lillian sat on the bed and finally let herself feel it. The terror of the escape, the uncertainty of what came next, the complete severing from everything she'd known. She'd done it. She'd actually left. And she had no idea if it had been brave or incredibly stupid. Catherine arrived the next morning with coffee and newspapers. She looked Lillian over critically. You look terrible. 14 hours in a wagon will do that. We need to do something about your appearance. Right now you look like exactly what you are, someone trying to disappear who hasn't quite figured out how. Catherine set down a package. New clothes, nothing expensive, nothing memorable, the kind of things a clerk or shopgirl would wear. Lillian opened it. Plain dresses, simple shoes, a coat that was worn but serviceable, the kind of things she used to own before Adrian, before the title, before everything. Change, Catherine said. Then we're going to see Lord Ashford. Now? He's expecting us. The transformation was startling. Looking in the small mirror above the washstand, Lillian barely recognized herself. The fancy clothes, the carefully styled hair, all the markers of the Duchess, gone. She looked ordinary, forgettable, perfect. Ashford's residence was in a better part of the city, though still not the aristocratic neighborhoods Lillian vaguely remembered from before her marriage. A townhouse, well-maintained, respectable without being ostentatious. The man who greeted them in the study was older than she'd expected, maybe 60, with gray hair and the kind of face that had probably been handsome before time and anger hardened it. Mrs. Vance, he said, using her maiden name, thank you for coming. I haven't agreed to anything yet. I know, sit, please. He gestured to chairs arranged around a low table. Catherine sat beside Lillian, silent but watchful. Ashford poured tea with steady hands. Lady Catherine has explained the situation? Some of it. You want revenge on Adrian for destroying your business 15 years ago. I want justice. There's a difference. Everyone keeps saying that. Sounds like semantics to me. He smiled slightly. Fair enough. The truth is, Adrian Blackthorne ruined me. Not through honest competition. I could have accepted that. Through deliberate fraud, manipulation of contracts, bribes to key officials. He was 23 years old and absolutely ruthless. By the time I realized what was happening, half my ships had been seized for supposed customs violations that were entirely fabricated. The business I'd spent 30 years building was gone in 6 months. Why didn't you fight it? I tried. The court sided with him. Money and title bought him protection I couldn't match. Ashford's expression darkened. But I've been patient, rebuilt slowly, carefully, made connections, gathered evidence, waited for an opportunity. And I am that opportunity. You have access to information I need, documents, correspondence, financial records, things that exist in Blackthorn Castle that I can't get any other way. I don't have access to anything anymore. I left. But you know where things are kept, how the household operates, who might be persuaded to help. He leaned forward. I'm not asking you to go back. I'm asking you to tell me what you learned while you were there. Lillian sipped her tea, buying time to think. What exactly are you trying to prove? That Adrian has been systematically defrauding his investors for over a decade, that the Haversham trial was just one small piece of a much larger pattern, that he's built his current fortune on lies and theft, and that the estate he controls was obtained through manipulation of his grandfather's will. That last part, what does that mean? Ashford exchanged a glance with Catherine. Adrian's grandfather didn't want him to inherit. He'd seen what Adrian had done to me, to others. He wanted to divide the estate among several cousins, people who would manage it responsibly. But Adrian convinced the old man to change the will in those final months. Convinced him, or coerced him, no one knows exactly what happened. The grandfather died, the new will appeared, and suddenly Adrian controlled everything. You think he forced it somehow? I think he manipulated a dying man, but I can't prove it without access to documents that are locked away in the castle. Lillian set down her cup. Even if what you're saying is true, even if I wanted to help, I don't see how I can. I left with one bag. I don't have documents or evidence or anything useful. You have something better, Catherine said. You have credibility. A witness account from the Duke's own wife carries weight that anonymous documents never could. What would you need me to testify to? Everything you observed, Ashford said. The financial irregularities, the disappearance after the wedding, his pattern of using people and discarding them. Combined with the evidence we've been gathering, it could be enough to trigger a full investigation. It was tempting, the idea of bringing Adrian down, of proving that his carefully constructed world was built on sand. There was appeal to that. But something held her back. What happens to the estate if you win, if you prove all this fraud? It would likely be divided among the legitimate heirs, managed by a trust until the legal challenges are resolved. And you'd get your shipping business back. Ashford's jaw tightened. That business is gone. This isn't about recovering what I lost. It's about preventing Adrian from destroying anyone else. You want me to believe this is altruistic? I want you to believe it's necessary. Whether I personally benefit is irrelevant. Lillian stood, paced to the window. The street below was busy with morning traffic, people going about their lives, completely unaware of the conversation happening above them. She thought about Adrian, about the wedding night, the months of isolation, the casual cruelty of abandonment. He deserved to face consequences. But she also thought about Mrs. Rothwell, who'd let her escape, about the servants who'd been kind when they didn't have to be, about the possibility that there were pieces to this story she still didn't understand. I need time, she said, to think about what I'm willing to do. We don't have unlimited time, Catherine warned. Once Adrian realizes you're gone, he probably already knows. Those writers Marcus mentioned, they were his, I'm sure of it, which means right now he's making decisions about how to handle this, and I need to make my own decisions without pressure. Ashford nodded slowly. 1 week. After that, with or without your help, we move forward. Fair enough. Catherine walked her back to the boarding house, neither of them speaking until they reached the blue door. You're not going to help him, are you? Catherine said. I don't know yet. Lillian, Adrian doesn't deserve your protection. I know, but that doesn't mean I trust Ashford's motives either. She met the other woman's eyes. Everyone in this situation wants to use me for something. At least Adrian was honest about it. Was he? Because from where I'm standing, he lied to you from the beginning. True. But he didn't pretend it was for my own good. Catherine's expression shifted. You're smarter than I gave you credit for. A lot of people make that mistake. Inside her small room, Lillian spent the rest of the day thinking. She'd escaped one trap only to find herself in another. Ashford and Catherine wanted her as a weapon against Adrian. Adrian wanted her as a legal formality. Nobody wanted her as herself. The realization crystallized something. If everyone was going to use her anyway, she might as well be the one controlling how. Over the next 3 days, Lillian explored London. She'd been to the city before briefly, but always under supervision. Now she wandered freely, learning the rhythms of different neighborhoods, watching how people moved and talked and lived. She visited employment agencies, asking about positions for women. She went to banks, inquiring about investment opportunities. She read newspapers obsessively, absorbing information about business, politics, society. And she started to see possibilities. The Women's Employment Agency led her to a small publishing house that needed a clerk. The owner, Mrs. Kensington, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd inherited the business from her husband and tripled its size. "Can you read and write clearly?" she asked during the interview. "Yes." "Basic mathematics?" "Yes." "And you're not going to run off and get married the moment some man shows interest?" "I'm done with marriage," Lillian said honestly. Mrs. Kensington smiled. "You're hired. Starts tomorrow, 8 in the morning. Don't be late." The work was tedious, copying correspondence, filing papers, running errands, but Lillian threw herself into it. It kept her mind occupied, gave her a reason to exist that had nothing to do with being someone's wife or pawn or revenge plot. On her 4th day in London, everything changed. She was walking back to the boarding house after work when she noticed the carriage. Expensive, unmarked, moving slowly along the street as if looking for something. For someone. Lillian ducked into a shop entrance, watching through the window as the carriage passed. It stopped 2 buildings down from Mrs. Henley's. A man got out. Not Adrian, but someone who carried himself with the same kind of authority. He spoke briefly with someone on the street, showing them something. A photograph, probably. They were looking for her. Lillian waited until the carriage moved on, then slipped out and walked in the opposite direction, her heart hammering. She couldn't go back to the boarding house. Couldn't go to Catherine. If they'd found Mrs. Henley's, they'd be watching all of Catherine's known addresses too. She needed somewhere they wouldn't think to look. The publishing house was closed for the evening, but Lillian had a key. Mrs. Kensington had given it to her for early deliveries. She let herself in, locked the door behind her, and sat in the dark office trying to think. Adrian was actively searching for her, which meant he cared, at least enough to want her found. The question was why? To drag her back? To ensure her silence about what she knew? Or something else? She stayed in the office that night, sleeping fitfully on the floor with her coat as a blanket. In the morning, she cleaned up any evidence of her presence and left before Mrs. Kensington arrived. For the next week, Lillian became a ghost. She showed up for work, performed her duties, and spent nights moving between different locations. Sometimes parks if the weather was mild, sometimes churches. Once in a train station. She avoided patterns, avoided places associated with Eleanor Marsh or Catherine or anyone connected to her escape, and slowly, carefully, she started building something new. Using the money from her job and what remained of the quarterly disbursement, she rented a tiny room under a third name, Mary Clark, a widow from the countryside. It was in a neighborhood so ordinary it was almost invisible, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as you paid rent. She kept working at the publishing house, kept her head down, kept learning. Mrs. Kensington started giving her more responsibility, editing submissions, corresponding with authors, even attending a few business meetings. "You're good at this," Mrs. Kensington said one afternoon. "Better than good. Where did you learn to negotiate?" "Watching people who are good at using others," Lillian said. "You pick up things." 2 months after leaving Blackthorn, Lillian was starting to feel almost safe. The searches had quieted. The carriage stopped appearing. Either Adrian had given up or he was being more subtle. Then Lord Ashford found her. She was leaving the publishing house after a late evening meeting when he stepped out of the shadows. "Hello, Mrs. Vance." Lillian's hand went to the small knife she'd started carrying. "How did you find me? I have resources, and you're not as invisible as you think." He raised his hands peacefully. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to warn you." "About what?" "Adrian knows where you are. Or he will soon. He's hired investigators, serious ones. They're good at what they do." Ashford's expression was grave. "You have maybe a week before they track you down." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm offering you a way out. Real protection, legal protection. But I need your help first." "We're back to this?" "We never left it. Lillian, running isn't going to work forever. You need something permanent. And the only way to get that is to make yourself too valuable to eliminate." "Eliminate?" The word sent ice through her veins. "You think Adrian would—" "I think Adrian is desperate. You're a loose end, a potential witness to things he's kept hidden. Desperate men do desperate things. Lillian leaned against the building wall, her mind racing. She'd been so focused on disappearing that she hadn't considered she might be in actual danger. What kind of help are we talking about? There's a safe in Blackthorn Castle, in Adrian's private study. It contains documents from his grandfather's final months, correspondence, medical records, early versions of the will. I need those documents. I can't get those. I'm here, the castle's there, and there are people looking for me. You wouldn't have to go yourself. You just have to tell us how to get in, layout of the study, security measures, where the safe is located. And then what? You break in and steal them? We acquire evidence of fraud, evidence that could bring down everything Adrian has built on lies. She wanted to say no, wanted to walk away from all of it, Ashford, Adrian, the whole mess, but he was right about one thing. Running wasn't sustainable. She needed leverage, protection, something that made her more valuable, alive and free than captured or silenced. If I do this, she said slowly, I want guarantees. Legal documents saying you'll protect me, provide for me, ensure my safety regardless of what happens with Adrian. Done. And I want to know the full plan. Not just the pieces that involve me. Everything. Ashford smiled. Now you're thinking like someone who might survive this. Come with me. We'll go through it all. They went to a different house this time, not his townhouse, but a nondescript building in a commercial district. Inside, the main room had been converted into something like a war room. Maps, documents, photographs spread across tables. Catherine was there, along with two men Lillian didn't recognize. She's in, Ashford announced. Are you sure about this? One of the men asked, studying Lillian skeptically. She's the Duke's wife. She lived in that house for months, and she's motivated. Ashford looked at Lillian. Aren't you? I'm motivated to stay alive and free. If helping you accomplishes that, then yes. Over the next 4 hours, they walked her through the plan. It was more complex than she'd expected, not just stealing documents, but creating a situation where those documents would be admissible in court, where they'd trigger investigations that couldn't be easily dismissed or buried. The key is timing, Catherine explained. We need to move before Adrian finds you, but after we've set up the legal framework to use what we find. How long? 2 weeks. Maybe 3. Ashford said I had a week before the investigators found me. Then we'll have to move faster. Lillian spent the next days in a strange limbo. She continued working at the publishing house during the day. Mrs. Kensington had become genuinely fond of her, and abandoning the job without explanation felt wrong. But her evenings were spent with Ashford's team, going over and over the details of Blackthorn Castle, drawing maps from memory, explaining routines and security measures. She told them about Mrs. Rothwell, about Thornton's embezzlement, about the layout of Adrian's study. She told them everything she could remember, feeling like a traitor and a survivor in equal measure. On the 8th day, everything accelerated. Lillian was working late at the publishing house when someone knocked on the locked front door. She froze, listening. The knock came again, more insistent. Mrs. Clark, I know you're in there. The voice was unfamiliar, male, authoritative. She moved carefully to the window, peered out. 3 men stood outside. Well-dressed, patient, the kind of people who knew they'd get what they wanted eventually. Investigators. Her heart kicked into overdrive. There was a back exit through the storage room. She'd made sure of that when she started working here. Lillian grabbed her coat and bag, moving as quietly as possible toward the rear of the building. We're not here to hurt you, the voice called out. The Duke simply wants to speak with you, to discuss arrangements. She didn't believe that for a second. The back door opened onto an alley. Lillian slipped through, closed it softly behind her, and ran. Behind her, she heard the front door shatter. They weren't bothering with pretense anymore. She ran through alleys and side streets, no clear destination except away. Her lungs burned, her feet screamed in the impractical shoes she wore for office work. Behind her, footsteps echoed, gaining ground. She turned a corner and nearly collided with a carriage. The door flew open. Get in, Catherine shouted. Lillian didn't hesitate. She threw herself into the carriage, and Catherine yelled to the driver. They lurched into motion just as the investigators rounded the corner behind them. How did you... We've been watching you, saw them coming. Catherine looked shaken. They're not playing around anymore, Lillian. This is serious. I know. We need to move up the timeline tomorrow night. That's too fast. We're not ready. We don't have a choice. Those men? They weren't hired to bring you back for a conversation. They were hired to make you disappear. The carriage raced through London's night streets, and Lillian felt the last of her illusions crumble. She wasn't a runaway wife anymore. She was prey being hunted by someone with unlimited resources and diminishing patience. And tomorrow night, she was going to help rob him. The safe house they took her to was cramped and smelled like mildew, but it was secure. Ashford arrived within an hour, bringing the finalized plan. Our man inside will create a distraction. You'll have exactly 15 minutes to get into the study, open the safe, and get out. Any longer, and you'll be caught. Wait, I'll be going in? Lillian stared at him. You said I just had to provide information. The plan changed. We need someone who knows the house, who can move through it naturally, someone who has a right to be there. I don't have a right to be there anymore. I'm a fugitive. You're the Duchess. And tomorrow night you're going home. Catherine handed her a small leather case. Everything you'll need: lockpicks, documents showing your authority to access the safe, a weapon if things go wrong. Lillian opened the case with shaking hands. This had spiraled so far beyond what she'd imagined. She'd wanted to escape, to build a new life. Instead, she was about to commit burglary against one of the most powerful men in the country. I can't do this, she whispered. You can, Ashford said firmly, because the alternative is spending the rest of your life running, always looking over your shoulder, always one step ahead of people who want you gone. This way you end it. You take control. Or I get caught and end up in prison, or worse. Then don't get caught. The next day crawled by. They kept her in the safe house, going over the plan repeatedly until Lillian could recite it in her sleep. Catherine drilled her on lock-picking techniques. The two men she didn't know, who turned out to be former military, hired specifically for this operation, taught her basic self-defense. If someone grabs you from behind, one demonstrated, drop your weight, elbow to the ribs, heel to the instep, then run like hell. Comforting, Lillian muttered. As evening approached, Catherine helped her change into clothes that would blend in, dark, practical, with pockets for tools. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror and saw a stranger. Not the Duchess, not Eleanor Marsh or Mary Clark, someone else entirely. Someone who broke into houses in the dark and stole documents that could destroy lives. Ready? Ashford asked. Lillian took a breath. No, but let's do it anyway. The carriage ride to Blackthorn took 3 hours. They stopped a mile from the estate, letting her out at a point where she could approach through the woods without being seen from the main drive. 15 minutes, Catherine reminded her. In and out. We'll be waiting here. Lillian nodded, not trusting her voice, and started walking. The grounds were dark, the castle visible only as a darker mass against the night sky. She'd left 2 months ago feeling like a prisoner escaping. Now she was returning as a thief. The irony wasn't lost on her. She made her way to a side entrance she'd discovered during her explorations, a door used by servants for early morning deliveries, usually unlocked until the kitchen staff went to bed. Her hand shook as she tried the handle. It opened. Inside, the castle was quiet, but not empty. She could hear distant sounds, someone working in the kitchen, footsteps on an upper floor. Lillian moved through familiar corridors that now felt alien, every shadow threatening to reveal someone who'd recognize her. The study was on the second floor. She took the servant's staircase, the one almost never used, and emerged into a hallway she recognized. Adrian's study was the third door on the left. She pressed her ear against it, listening for any sound of occupation. Nothing. The handle turned easily. He'd never locked it during her time here, arrogant in his assumption of security. The room looked exactly as she remembered. Large desk, bookshelves lining the walls, a portrait of his father above the fireplace. And behind the desk, partially hidden by a panel that looked like part of the wall, the safe. Lillian closed the door behind her, locked it, and moved quickly to the safe. The leather case Catherine had given her contained lockpicks and detailed instructions. Her hands were sweating so badly she had to wipe them on her pants before attempting the mechanism. The first pick slipped. The second caught, but wouldn't turn. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to remember the training. Click. The safe opened. Inside were dozens of documents, all carefully organized. Lillian grabbed the ones marked with dates from 3 years before Adrian's grandfather's death. Those would be the early versions of the will, the ones showing the old man's original intentions. She was stuffing them into her bag when she heard it. Footsteps in the hallway outside, coming closer. Lillian froze, documents half stuffed into her bag, her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. A pause. Then the handle turned. She'd locked it. Thank everything, she'd locked it. Strange, a male voice, unfamiliar. It's never locked. His Grace probably did it earlier. Another voice, also male. Come on, Thornton's waiting downstairs. The footsteps retreated. Lillian waited a full minute, blood pounding in her ears, before she moved again. Her hands shook so badly she dropped one of the documents. She snatched it up, shoved everything into the bag, closed the safe, repositioned the panel. 12 minutes since she'd entered the castle. She had 3 left. She unlocked the study door, cracked it open. The hallway was empty. She slipped out, retraced her path to the servants' staircase, forced herself to move quietly when every instinct screamed to run. The kitchen was still occupied. She could hear voices, the clatter of dishes being washed. She'd have to go through the main hallway instead, risk the more exposed route. Halfway across, she heard a door open behind her. You there? She didn't turn around. Didn't run. Just kept walking at the same measured pace. Stop! Lillian reached the side door and pushed through it, breaking into a sprint the moment she hit the grounds. Behind her, someone was shouting. Lights flickered on in the castle windows. She ran through the gardens, through the woods, branches whipping her face, roots trying to catch her feet. The bag banged against her hip with every step, the documents inside suddenly feeling like they weighed 1,000 pounds. The carriage was where they'd left it. Catherine threw the door open before Lillian even reached it. Go, go, go! Lillian dove inside and the carriage lurched forward. Through the small rear window, she could see lights moving in the distance, people searching, horses being readied. Did you get it? Ashford demanded. She couldn't speak yet, just held up the bag. Catherine pulled out the documents, examining them by lamplight as the carriage raced through the night. These are good, really good. Early will versions, correspondence between the grandfather and his solicitor, medical assessments showing he was of sound mind when he wrote the original will. She looked up, eyes bright. This is exactly what we needed. Someone saw me, Lillian managed between gasping breaths. They're coming. We have a head start and a plan. Ashford knocked on the roof. The driver changed direction, turning onto a side road that led away from London. Where are we going? Somewhere Adrian won't think to look. Not immediately. He settled back against the seat, studying her. You did well. I almost got caught. Almost doesn't count. You got out, you got the documents, and now we can finally move against him properly. The carriage traveled for hours, stopping once to change horses, then continuing through the night and into early morning. Lillian dozed fitfully, waking every time they hit a rut in the road, her mind replaying the moment she'd heard footsteps outside the study. They arrived at a country house just as dawn was breaking. Nothing grand, a modest estate that looked like it belonged to minor gentry, surrounded by farmland. This is owned by a friend who owes me favors, Ashford explained as they went inside. Adrian doesn't know about the connection. We can stay here while we prepare the legal case. Lillian was shown to a bedroom that was clean and comfortable, but clearly hadn't been used in months. Dust covered the furniture and the air smelled stale. She didn't care. She collapsed onto the bed fully clothed and slept for 12 hours straight. When she woke, it was late afternoon. She found Catherine and Ashford in what must have been the library, documents spread across every surface. Finally, Catherine said, we were about to check if you were still breathing. Barely. Lillian's whole body ached. What's the situation? Ashford looked up from a letter he was reading. We've sent copies of the most damning documents to 3 different solicitors, along with statements outlining Adrian's pattern of fraud. By tomorrow morning, they'll file formal complaints with the courts. What happens then? Investigation. Probably a hearing to determine if there's enough evidence for a full trial. If we're lucky, injunctions freezing his assets until the matter is resolved. And if we're unlucky, Adrian uses his influence to bury it all, and we're back where we started. Except now he knows we have the documents, which makes us even bigger targets. Catherine handed Lillian a newspaper. You should see this. The headline made her stomach drop. Duchess of Blackthorn missing, Duke offers reward for information. The article described her as mentally unstable and possibly in danger. It claimed Adrian was desperately worried about his wife's well-being, that she'd disappeared without warning, that anyone with information should contact the authorities immediately. "He's making me sound insane," Lillian said flatly. "He's making himself sound like a concerned husband. It's actually brilliant, in a horrible way." Catherine took the paper back. "If you come forward now, he can claim you had a breakdown. Anything you say against him gets dismissed as the ramblings of an unwell woman. So what do I do?" "Stay hidden. Let the documents speak for themselves. Once the legal process is in motion, your testimony becomes supporting evidence rather than the foundation of the case." Lillian paced to the window. Outside, farmland stretched to the horizon, peaceful and ordinary. "How long do we have to stay here?" "A week, maybe 2, until we're certain the legal protections are in place." A week trapped in another house, waiting for men to decide her fate. The irony was almost funny. Over the next days, Lillian watched Ashford and Catherine work. They were meticulous, building a case from the documents she'd stolen, cross-referencing dates and amounts, finding patterns that told a story of systematic fraud. Adrian hadn't just manipulated his grandfather's will. He'd been running variations of the same scheme for years, targeting people who couldn't fight back effectively. "He's careful," Ashford admitted. "Nothing obvious enough to trigger immediate investigation. But once you know what to look for, the pattern is clear." "How many people has he done this to?" "That we can prove? 7, including me." His expression hardened. "There are probably more we don't know about." On the 4th day, a messenger arrived with news. The complaints had been filed. A judge had agreed to review the evidence. Adrian had been formally notified of the investigation. "How did he react?" Lillian asked. The messenger, a young man named Thomas, grimaced, denied everything, said the documents were forgeries, that his wife had stolen them as part of some vindictive scheme. "He's demanding she be located and questioned." "Of course he is." Lillian felt something cold settle in her chest. "So now I'm not just unstable, I'm a thief and a liar." "He's on the defensive," Catherine said. "That's actually good. It means he's worried." 2 days later, they got word that the judge had ordered Adrian's financial records to be audited. Not a full trial yet, but a significant step. Banks were being contacted, investments reviewed, business partners questioned. "It's working," Ashford said, allowing himself a small smile. "The walls are closing in." But that night, everything changed. Lillian was reading in her room when she heard shouting downstairs. She grabbed the small knife from the bedside table. She'd started keeping it close after the break-in at the publishing house, and moved quietly to the hallway. More voices, urgent and overlapping. She descended the stairs carefully. In the entrance hall, Ashford was arguing with 2 men she didn't recognize. Catherine stood off to the side, her face pale. "Absolutely no authority to," Ashford was saying. "We have a warrant," one of the men interrupted, holding up a document, "signed by a magistrate. This property is to be searched for stolen documents and a missing person." "On what grounds?" "The Duke of Blackthorn has filed a formal complaint alleging theft of private papers and unlawful imprisonment of his wife." Lillian's hand tightened on the knife. Unlawful imprisonment. Adrian was claiming they'd kidnapped her. "That's absurd," Catherine said. "Mrs. Vance came willingly. She's not being held against her will." "Then she can tell us that herself." The second man looked around. "Where is she?" Lillian made a decision. She descended the rest of the stairs, keeping the knife hidden behind her back. "I'm here." All eyes turned to her. The 2 men studied her with professional assessment. "Mrs. Vance? Or should we say Duchess Blackthorn?" "Lillian Vance. I stopped being a duchess when I left." "That's not how marriage works, ma'am. You're legally the Duke's wife until a court says otherwise." The first man consulted his warrant. "We need you to come with us, answer some questions." "What if I refuse?" "Then we'll be forced to detain you for obstruction. This can be easy or difficult, ma'am. Your choice." Ashford stepped forward. "She's not going anywhere without legal representation. I'll contact my solicitor." "She's going now. You're welcome to have your solicitor meet us at the magistrate's office." The man moved toward Lillian. "Ma'am, please come with us." Catherine caught her eye, gave the smallest shake of her head. "Don't fight. Not yet." Lillian set down the knife on a side table, deliberately visible, and walked toward the door. I'll go, but I want it noted that I'm cooperating voluntarily. I'm not being rescued from anything except my own marriage. The carriage they put her in was nicer than the one that had brought her here, but it felt like a prison on wheels. The two men sat across from her, not speaking, just watching, making sure she didn't try to run. The magistrate's office was in a town 20 minutes away, a small building, cramped and smelling of old paper and lamp oil. The magistrate himself was an older man with shrewd eyes who looked like he'd seen every variation of human foolishness. "Sit down, Mrs. Blackthorne." "Vance, your legal name is Blackthorne, whether you like it or not." He opened a folder. "The Duke is very concerned about you. Claims you've been missing for 2 months, that you were seen in the company of known criminals, that you broke into his home and stole valuable documents. I left my husband because he abandoned me. I've been staying with friends. And I didn't steal anything. I retrieved papers that belonged to me as much as to him. The Duke says you've been mentally unwell, that you had a breakdown after the wedding." "The Duke is lying." The magistrate's eyebrow rose. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth. He married me for legal purposes, ignored me for months, and now he's upset that I won't quietly accept that treatment." "Do you have evidence of this alleged mistreatment?" "I have my own experience. I have servants who witnessed it. I have—" "Servants loyal to the Duke, you mean? Who would testify against their employer?" Lillian realized the trap. Everything she could say would be dismissed as bias or delusion. Adrian had positioned this perfectly. Concerned husband, unstable wife, neutral authorities trying to sort out the truth. "What happens now?" she asked. "I'm ordering you remanded to the Duke's custody. He's agreed to ensure you receive proper medical attention, and—" "No!" The word came out harder than she'd intended. "I'm not going back to him. Mrs. Blackthorne, you don't have a choice. You're his wife. Legally, he has authority over your person and your welfare. That's medieval. That's the law." Lillian stood, her mind racing. If they sent her back to Adrian, everything was over. The documents Ashford had wouldn't matter. She'd be locked away somewhere, dismissed as insane, unable to testify or corroborate anything. "I have information about the Duke's criminal activities," she said. "Business fraud, document forgery, manipulation of his grandfather's will. I'm a material witness in an ongoing investigation. You can't just hand me over to the person being investigated." The magistrate's expression shifted slightly. "What investigation?" "The one his business partners are conducting. The formal complaints filed 3 days ago. The audit that's been ordered." She was improvising now, pulling together everything she knew. "If you send me back to him, you're interfering with a legal proceeding. I've heard nothing about any investigation." "Then you need to talk to the solicitors handling it, before you make a decision that looks very bad in retrospect." The magistrate studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to one of the men who'd brought her. "Check with the county court, see if there's any truth to this." While they waited, Lillian sat rigidly in her chair, trying not to show how terrified she was. If the investigation hadn't been filed properly, if there was some delay or bureaucratic error, she was finished. 20 minutes later, the man returned. "There is an investigation filed 2 days ago. Multiple complaints from former business associates alleging fraud and misrepresentation." The magistrate's jaw tightened. "Why wasn't I informed?" "Different jurisdiction, sir. County court, not local magistrate." "Nevertheless," he looked at Lillian with new assessment. "This complicates things. It means I'm right, and sending me back to a man being investigated for fraud makes you complicit if anything happens to me." "Don't threaten me, young woman." "I'm not threatening. I'm stating facts." Lillian leaned forward. "The Duke wants me back because I know things. I saw documents, heard conversations, observed behaviors that support the fraud allegations. I'm not unstable. I'm inconvenient." The magistrate was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "I'm going to place you in protective custody until this matter is resolved. Not with the Duke, not with Lord Ashford, a neutral party." "Who?" "The Sisters of Mercy maintain a house for women in difficult circumstances. You'll stay there until the investigation concludes and the court determines your status." It wasn't perfect, but it was better than being handed back to Adrian. "Fine." The convent was austere but not unkind. The sisters asked no questions, simply showed Lillian to a small room and told her meals were communal. She was free to move around the grounds, but couldn't leave without permission. It was still a cage, but a more comfortable one. She'd been there 3 days when Catherine found a way to visit, claiming to be Lillian's cousin. Ashford is livid, Catherine reported. He wanted to file an immediate appeal, but his solicitors advised against it. Apparently, the magistrate's decision was legally sound given the circumstances. What about the investigation? Moving forward, slowly, Adrian's fighting every step, using every delay tactic his lawyers can think of, but they can't stop it entirely. Catherine handed her a newspaper. You should read this. The article was different from the earlier ones. This one questioned Adrian's version of events, pointed out inconsistencies in his timeline, noted that his wife had disappeared shortly after testifying against him in the Haversham trial. Public opinion was starting to shift. Who wrote this? Lillian asked. Anonymous source, but I may have provided some background information to a sympathetic journalist. Over the next 2 weeks, more articles appeared. The investigation became public knowledge. Other victims came forward, people Adrian had defrauded over the years who'd been too intimidated to speak up before. The tide was turning. Lillian read every article, absorbed every development, and felt something unfamiliar growing inside her. Not hope exactly, but possibility. On the 16th day of her stay at the convent, a sister informed her she had a visitor. Not Catherine this time, Adrian. She almost refused to see him. But curiosity won. She wanted to look him in the eye now that the power between them had shifted. He waited in a small receiving room, standing by the window with his back to her. When he turned, she was shocked by his appearance. He'd lost weight. There were dark circles under his eyes. He looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Lillian, Your Grace. She kept her tone formal, cold. Don't. His voice cracked slightly. Please don't. Don't what? Treat you with the same indifference you showed me? He flinched. I deserve that. You deserve worse. She sat down, gestured for him to do the same. He did, moving like someone much older than his years. Why are you here? To apologize, to explain, I don't even know. He ran a hand through his hair. Everything is falling apart. The investigation, the business partners turning on me, the press. And I know it's my own fault, but I never wanted... What? You never wanted consequences? You never wanted your actions to catch up with you? I never wanted you to be hurt. She laughed, sharp and bitter. That's a lie. It's not. He leaned forward, earnest in a way she'd never seen him. When I married you, I thought I was protecting you, keeping you away from the mess I'd made, the enemies I'd accumulated. I thought if you didn't know anything, couldn't testify to anything, you'd be safe. That's the stupidest protection I've ever heard of. I know. I realize that now. His hands twisted together. I've been trying to clean up my father's mistakes for 15 years. He destroyed everything, the family reputation, the finances, relationships with every major house. When he died, I inherited nothing but debt and enemies. So I did whatever I had to do to rebuild. And some of it was illegal. Some of it was unforgivable. Like manipulating your grandfather's will? He looked away. You wanted to punish me. Divide the estate among people who'd done nothing to earn it, who'd stood by while my father burned everything down. I couldn't let that happen. So yes, I manipulated him, convinced him I'd changed, that I deserved another chance. And when he still wouldn't budge, He stopped. You what? I had his doctor adjust the medical reports, made it look like he was suffering from dementia, that his decision-making was compromised. Then I produced a new will that was actually the old one I'd written myself. Adrian's voice was hollow. He died thinking he'd protected everyone from me. He died hating me. The confession hung in the air between them. Why are you telling me this? Lillian asked. Because you deserve the truth. Because I'm tired of lying. He met her eyes. And because I need you to know that when I married you, when I left you alone in that castle, it wasn't because you didn't matter. It was because you mattered too much. And I didn't know what to do with that. What does that mean? It means I was falling in love with you. During the courtship, during the wedding. And it terrified me. Because everyone I've ever cared about has either betrayed me or died or been destroyed by association with me. His voice broke. So I left. I thought if I kept you at a distance, you'd be safe from everything I'd done, everything I was still doing. I thought I was protecting you. Lillian stared at him, trying to process the words. He'd loved her? This whole nightmare, the abandonment, the isolation, all of it because he'd loved her and been too broken to know how to show it? That's the most selfish thing I've ever heard, she said quietly. I know. You don't get to make decisions about my safety without consulting me. You don't get to decide what I can handle or what I deserve to know. You treated me like a child, like property, like something to be managed instead of a person with my own agency. I know. He dropped his head into his hands. I know, and I'm sorry, and I would do anything to take it back. You can't take it back. The damage is done. They sat in silence for a while. Outside the window, Lillian could hear the sisters singing evening prayers. Finally, Adrian said, "The investigation is going to find me guilty. There's too much evidence, too many people willing to testify. I'll probably lose everything, the title, the estate, possibly my freedom." Good. He smiled sadly. Good. You're right. But Lillian, I need you to know that none of this is your fault. You didn't betray me by leaving. You did what you had to do to survive, and I'm proud of you for it. Don't. She stood up, suddenly unable to sit still. Don't try to make this some noble sacrifice. You're not a tragic hero. You're just a man who made terrible choices and is finally facing the consequences. I know what I am. Adrian stood as well. I came here to tell you that I'm going to make sure you're protected. Whatever happens to me, I'm putting money aside for you. Enough to live independently, comfortably. It's the least I owe you. I don't want your money. Take it anyway. Please. Let me do one thing right. A sister appeared at the door. Visiting hours are over. Adrian nodded, moved toward the exit, then paused. For what it's worth, and I know it's worth nothing, I do love you. I have since the moment you stood up in that courtroom and told the truth instead of protecting me. That's when I realized I'd married someone extraordinary. He left before she could respond. Lillian sank back into the chair, her mind reeling. She'd expected defiance, maybe threats, possibly even more manipulation. Not confession, not vulnerability, not love. She didn't know what to do with any of it. The next morning, Catherine arrived with stunning news. Adrian withdrew his complaint against you, told the magistrate you were free to go, that he'd been mistaken about the circumstances of your departure. Why would he do that? I don't know, but it gets better. 3 of his major business partners have agreed to testify against him in exchange for immunity. The case is solid now. The trial date is set for next month. Lillian walked out of the convent that afternoon into autumn sunshine that felt impossibly bright. She'd been in various forms of captivity for 2 months. Blackthorn Castle, hiding in London, the convent. Now she was actually free. She met with Ashford the next day at his townhouse. He looked triumphant. We did it. Everything we needed is in place. The trial will expose everything Adrian's done, redistribute the estate to the rightful heirs, and put him in prison for fraud. What happens to me? Lillian asked. You'll testify. Tell the court what you observed. Then you'll receive your portion of the settlement, a significant amount, enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. He smiled. You'll finally be free of him. But as Lillian walked through London that evening, watching the city come alive with lights and noise, she realized something. She'd spent months thinking of herself as Adrian's victim, but somewhere along the way she'd become something else. She'd become the woman who'd escaped, who'd survived, who'd helped bring down one of the most powerful men in the country. And now people were starting to notice. The next week, Mrs. Kensington from the publishing house tracked her down. I heard what happened, the whole story. The older woman studied her. You were working for me under a false name. I was hiding. I know, and I don't care. Mrs. Kensington pulled out a business card. I'm starting a new venture, publishing house specifically for women writers. I want someone smart, resourceful, and impossible to intimidate. Interested? Lillian looked at the card, looked at this woman who was offering her something nobody else had, a future built on her own merit rather than her connection to someone else. Yes, she said, I'm interested. The trial date approached. Lillian prepared her testimony with Ashford's solicitors, going over every detail of what she'd observed at Blackthorn. The fraud, the embezzlement she'd discovered, the documents in the safe, Adrian's confession to manipulating his grandfather. The night before the trial, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Adrian's visit to the convent, his confession, the hollow look in his eyes. He'd destroyed himself, and she'd helped finish what he'd started. The question was whether she felt guilty about it. She examined her conscience carefully, looking for remorse. Found none. What she found instead was satisfaction. Not pleasure in his suffering, but satisfaction in the justice of it. Actions had consequences, even for dukes. The trial began on a cold November morning. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, aristocrats, curious onlookers. Everyone wanted to watch the Duke of Blackthorn fall. Lillian testified for 3 hours. She told them everything. The abandonment, the isolation, the discovery of fraud, the locked safe, and what it contained. She described Adrian's visit, his confession, his admission of manipulating a dying man. The defense attorney tried to discredit her, called her bitter, vindictive, a woman scorned who'd say anything for revenge. "Is that why you left?" he demanded. "Because the Duke wouldn't play the devoted husband?" "I left because I refused to be complicit in his crimes through silence," Lillian said clearly. "I left because staying would have made me his accomplice. And I'm testifying now because the truth matters more than my pride or comfort or whatever you're implying motivated me." The courtroom was silent. When she finished, she looked directly at Adrian for the first time since entering the room. He sat at the defense table, perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. Just once. A tiny acknowledgement that she'd done what she had to do. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Every day brought new revelations, new witnesses, new evidence of systematic fraud spanning over a decade. By the end, even Adrian's lawyers looked defeated. The jury took 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison and ordered the complete dissolution of the Blackthorn estate. Everything would be sold, debts paid, and remaining assets distributed among the legitimate heirs and victims of his fraud. Lillian stood in the courtroom gallery as they led Adrian away in chains. He didn't look at her, didn't look at anyone, just walked out with his head high, facing his consequences with the same arrogance he'd faced everything else. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her. "How do you feel about the verdict? Are you satisfied with the outcome? What will you do now?" Lillian looked at them all, these people who wanted to reduce her story to a headline, and smiled. "I'm going to live," she said simply. "For the first time in my life, I'm going to live on my own terms." And then she walked away from the cameras, from the questions, from everything that had defined her for the past year. 3 days later, the settlement arrived. Not as much as Ashford had promised, the estate's debts were larger than anyone had realized, but enough. More than enough. Lillian accepted the position with Mrs. Kensington's publishing house, started working with women writers whose stories had been dismissed or ignored, found that she was good at recognizing talent, at nurturing voices that deserved to be heard. She rented a small apartment in a respectable neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it was hers. Every piece of furniture, every book, every decision about how to arrange the space, all hers. For the first time since her parents died, Lillian Vance belonged to herself. 3 years passed before Lillian saw Blackthorn Castle again. She didn't plan to return. The estate had been sold off in pieces, the main house to a manufacturing baron, the farmlands to various local families, the artwork and furniture auctioned to collectors across Europe. Everything Adrian had built, everything he'd destroyed himself trying to protect, scattered to the winds like ash. But Mrs. Kensington's publishing house had thrived, and with it, Lillian's reputation. She'd developed an eye for manuscripts that would sell, stories that mattered, voices that needed amplification. The business had expanded beyond women's fiction into political writing, social commentary, even some experimental poetry that confused reviewers but sold surprisingly well. She'd made herself into something. Not a duchess, not a victim. Just Lillian Vance, editor and silent partner in one of London's most innovative publishing ventures. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, delivered by a messenger who waited for a response. "Mrs. Vance, there's a matter requiring your attention at the Blackthorn property. The new owner requests your presence at your earliest convenience." Lillian turned the envelope over in her hands. Heavy paper, expensive. "What matter?" "I wasn't told specifics, ma'am. Only that it concerns items that may belong to you by right." She almost refused, almost sent the messenger away with a polite decline and went back to the manuscript she'd been reviewing. But curiosity, the same curiosity that had driven her to study the estate ledgers, to question Thornton's embezzlement, to break into Adrian's study that night, won out. "Tell them I'll come on Friday." The journey was easier this time. She traveled by train to the nearest station, then hired a carriage for the final leg. No hiding in wagons, no fear of being caught. Just a woman visiting a property that had once been her prison. The castle looked different, less gothic somehow, in the spring sunlight. The new owner had done some work on the grounds. The gardens were manicured, the stonework repaired where weather had damaged it. It looked like a home rather than a monument to old power. A butler met her at the entrance, younger than any servant Adrian would have hired, with a friendly face that suggested the household had undergone more than cosmetic changes. "Mrs. Vance, welcome. Mr. Hartford is expecting you in the library." Hartford, the manufacturing baron. She'd read about him. Self-made, progressive politics, reputation for treating workers fairly. Not the kind of person Adrian would have associated with. He stood when she entered the library, a big man in his 50s with calloused hands that didn't match his expensive suit. "Mrs. Vance, thank you for coming." His handshake was firm, direct. "I hope the journey wasn't too taxing." "Not at all. Your message said you found items belonging to me." "In a manner of speaking, please, sit." He gestured to chairs that were new, comfortable, modern things instead of Adrian's antiques. When we purchased the property, there were several rooms that had been locked. The previous owner's study primarily, and a few storage spaces. We found some documents and personal items that seemed significant. He handed her a wooden box. Lillian opened it carefully. Inside were letters. Her letters, the ones she'd written to her mother's cousin Eleanor years ago, asking about life in America. Letters she'd thought were lost. And beneath them, a journal she didn't recognize, bound in leather that had aged to a soft brown. "Where did you find these?" "Hidden compartment in the study desk, behind a false panel." Hartford's expression was serious. "There's more." "The journal. I took the liberty of reading enough to understand what it was. I think you should see it." Lillian opened the journal. The handwriting was Adrian's, unmistakable even after 3 years. The first entry was dated 2 weeks before their wedding. "I'm making a terrible mistake, but I don't know how to stop it. She deserves better than what I can offer. Better than the mess I've made of everything. But I need this marriage for the estate, and she's the only option that doesn't come with political complications or family entanglements that would make everything worse." She smiled at me today when I brought her flowers. Actually smiled, like she was happy to see me. When was the last time anyone was happy to see me? Lillian's hands trembled slightly. She turned pages, reading entries that chronicled their brief courtship from Adrian's perspective. His guilt over using her. His growing attraction that he clearly hadn't wanted to feel. His terror at the possibility of caring about someone when everyone he'd ever cared about had been destroyed by association with him. "The wedding is tomorrow. I should be relieved. One more piece in place, one more protection against my cousin's legal challenges. Instead, I'm awake at 3 in the morning, sick with the knowledge that I'm about to ruin her life." The entry from their wedding night was barely legible, the handwriting shaky. "I left. I couldn't stay in that room with her looking at me like I was someone worth marrying. I couldn't lie next to her and pretend this was real when I know everything I touch turns to poison. She'll hate me for this. She should. But at least she'll be safe from the worst of what's coming." Lillian read through months of entries. Adrian documenting her movements through the castle like a ghost documenting another ghost. His awareness of her growing understanding of the estate's operations. His admiration for how she'd handled the Haversham testimony, mixed with fury at himself for putting her in that position. She's not broken. I thought isolation would break her, thought she'd become compliant, or at least resigned. Instead, she's learning, studying, building something I can't see yet, but can sense. She's going to leave me. The only question is when. The entries grew more erratic after her disappearance. Guilt, self-recrimination, attempts to justify his choices that devolved into incoherent rage at himself. "Found out she's in London. The investigators want to bring her back by force if necessary. I told them no. If she's found the strength to leave, I won't be the one to drag her back to hell. Ashford has the documents. My solicitor confirmed it. She went back for them, broke into my study, risked everything to take me down. I should be furious. Instead, I'm proud of her. She did what I never could, chose truth over self-preservation." The final entry was dated the day before Adrian's confession at the convent. "Tomorrow, I'll see her. Tell her everything, though it won't change anything. The trial will proceed, I'll lose everything, and she'll finally be free of me. This is how it should end. Not with forgiveness, I don't deserve that, but with honesty. She earned that much through everything I put her through. If there's any justice in the world, she'll build something beautiful from the wreckage I'm leaving behind. Lillian closed the journal, her vision blurred. She'd spent 3 years thinking of Adrian as the villain of her story. And he was. His actions had been cruel, manipulative, devastating. But he'd also been trapped in his own way, destroyed by the same system that had used her as a pawn. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it complicated the simple narrative she'd built. "Are you all right?" Hartford asked quietly. "I don't know." She touched the journal's cover. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I think you deserve the full story. Whatever you decide to do with it." He stood, moved to the window. "There's something else. The Duke left instructions with my solicitor before he was imprisoned. Money that was supposed to be held in trust for you. A significant amount. He told me he'd do that. I refused it. He did it anyway, and it's been accruing interest for 3 years. Hartford named a sum that made Lillian's breath catch. He specified that it was to be given to you only if you came here voluntarily, not tracked down, not coerced, only if you chose to return. That's manipulative as hell. Perhaps. Or perhaps it's the only way he knew to give you a choice. Hartford handed her a folder. These are the trust documents. You can accept it or refuse it. Either way, the decision is yours. Lillian looked at the numbers, at the financial security they represented. Enough to expand the publishing house, to fund the women's education initiatives she'd been planning, to never worry about money again. But accepting it meant acknowledging some complexity in her feelings about Adrian, meant admitting that the man who'd hurt her had also, in his broken way, tried to protect her. "Can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need. The money isn't going anywhere." After Hartford left, Lillian wandered the castle alone. The new owner had given her permission to explore, and she found herself drawn to familiar paths. The library where she'd spent so many isolated afternoons, the dining room where she'd eaten solitary meals, the bedroom that had been her prison. All of it looked different now. Lighter. The oppressive weight of Adrian's presence had lifted, replaced by something more hopeful. She ended up in the gardens, in the spot where Mrs. Rothwell had let her escape. The overgrown wildness had been tamed into something beautiful, planned chaos rather than neglect. "Thought I might find you here." Lillian turned. Mrs. Rothwell stood on the path, older and grayer, but unmistakably herself. "You're still here?" "Mr. Hartford kept most of the staff who wanted to stay, figured we knew the house better than anyone else could." The older woman studied her. "You look well." "I am well." Finally, Lillian gestured to the garden. "You let me go that night. I never got to thank you." "Nothing to thank me for. You were leaving one way or another. I just made sure it was on your terms instead of as a scandal that would have destroyed you both." Mrs. Rothwell sat on a nearby bench. "His Grace asked me about you before the trial. Wanted to know if you seemed happy in London." "What did you tell him?" "That you were surviving, that you'd found work, found your footing, that you were doing exactly what you should have been allowed to do from the beginning, living your own life." She paused. "He cried. Only time I ever saw him cry in 20 years of service." Lillian sat beside her, processing this. "Did you know? About the fraud, the manipulation, all of it?" "Suspected some. Knew he was carrying secrets that were eating him alive. But the specifics?" She shook her head. "He kept those close." "Do you hate him for what he did?" "Hate's too simple. He was a boy who inherited an impossible situation and made terrible choices trying to fix it. Doesn't excuse the choices, but it explains them." Mrs. Rothwell looked at her directly. "Do you hate him?" Lillian considered the question honestly. "I did. For a long time. Now I'm just tired of hating. It doesn't change anything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching birds move through the gardens. Finally, Mrs. Rothwell said, "He writes to me sometimes. From prison. Asks about the house, about the staff who stayed. Never asks about you directly, but I can tell he wants to know." "What do you tell him?" "The truth. That you've built something remarkable. That you're respected in your field. That you're finally the person you were meant to be." She stood, brushing off her skirt. "Whether you choose to forgive him or not, whether you accept his money or not, None of that changes what you've accomplished. You did that yourself. After Mrs. Rothwell left, Lillian remained in the garden until the sun started to set. She thought about the girl who'd arrived here 3 years ago, desperate for security, willing to accept crumbs of affection from a man who could barely stand to look at her. That girl was gone. In her place was someone harder, smarter, less willing to accept other people's definitions of who she should be. She thought about Adrian, locked in a prison cell, living with the consequences of his choices. She didn't owe him forgiveness, didn't owe him understanding or sympathy or anything at all. But she could choose to give those things anyway. Not for him, for herself. Because holding on to anger was just another form of prison, and she'd had enough of those to last a lifetime. The next morning, Lillian signed the trust documents, accepted the money Adrian had left for her, with the understanding that she'd use it on her own terms for her own purposes. Before she left Blackthorn, she wrote a letter, addressed it to the prison where Adrian was serving his sentence. The words came slowly, carefully chosen. Adrian, I received your journal. Read every entry. I understand now what you were trying to do, even if I think your methods were catastrophically wrong. You were right about one thing. I've built something from the wreckage. A business, a life, a version of myself that isn't defined by being someone's wife or pawn or victim. I did that despite you, not because of you. But I'm writing to tell you that I don't hate you anymore. Hate requires energy. I'd rather spend on things that matter, and you don't matter to me, not in the way you used to. Not as the villain of my story, or the love that failed, or any other narrative weight I tried to assign you. You're just a man who made terrible choices and is paying for them. I hope prison teaches you something about yourself. I hope you find some kind of peace, though you don't deserve it any more than I deserved what you put me through. I'm accepting the trust you left, not because I forgive you. Forgiveness implies you have some claim on my judgment, and you don't. I'm accepting it because it's useful, and because refusing it would be letting you influence my decisions from a prison cell. I'm done letting you influence anything. This is the last time I'll think about you. After this, you're just someone I used to know. Someone who taught me what I don't want and who I refuse to become. Live with your consequences. I'm living with my choices. Lillian. She sealed the letter, handed it to Hartford's butler for posting, and left Blackthorn Castle for the last time. The publishing house was busy when she returned. Mrs. Kensington had accepted 3 new manuscripts in Lillian's absence, all by first-time women authors who'd been rejected elsewhere. This one's special, she said, handing Lillian a manuscript. Raw, but special. About a woman who escapes an arranged marriage and starts a school for girls who have nowhere else to go. Lillian read the first pages, felt something resonate. We'll publish it, and I want to fund the school she describes. Make it real, not just fiction. That'll take serious money. I have serious money now. She explained about the trust, about Adrian's last gift that wasn't really a gift at all, but a release. Mrs. Kensington listened, then smiled. You're going to do something remarkable with that money, aren't you? I'm going to make sure other women don't end up like I did. Powerless, trapped, dependent on men who see them as property. Lillian looked around the office, at the manuscripts piled on every surface, at the evidence of what they'd built together. We're going to fund education, legal support, safe houses for women leaving dangerous situations. We're going to publish the stories that need telling and create the infrastructure so other women can escape their own blackthorns. Over the next year, the Vance Foundation took shape. Schools for women who'd been denied education, legal clinics for those trapped in impossible marriages, lending programs for women trying to start businesses, publishing grants for voices that had been silenced. Lillian threw herself into it with the same intensity she'd once used to study the Blackthorn estate ledgers. But this time, the knowledge she gained was used to help rather than survive. The society papers wrote about her occasionally. The Duchess who wasn't, they called her, or the woman who brought down Blackthorn. The headlines were dramatic and mostly inaccurate, but Lillian didn't bother correcting them. Let people think whatever they wanted. She was too busy doing actual work to care about narrative. 2 years after leaving Blackthorn for the last time, she received a letter from the prison warden. Adrian had been released early for good behavior, his sentence reduced to 8 years served. He'd left the country immediately, headed for America, and had no plans to return to England. Lillian read the letter twice, felt absolutely nothing, and filed it away. He was someone else's problem now. Or better yet, his own problem. Either way, not hers. On a cold December evening, 5 years after her wedding night, Lillian stood in a hall filled with women. Young ones and old ones, rich and poor, educated and illiterate. They'd gathered for the opening of the Foundation's 5th school, this one in the industrial north, serving girls whose families couldn't afford to keep them in education. "We're here because someone believed women deserve more than they're given," Lillian said to the assembly. "Because stories matter, and voices matter, and the ability to choose your own path matters more than anything else." She looked out at faces that reminded her of her own 5 years ago, lost, looking for something to hold on to, not quite believing that escape was possible. You will be told you're not good enough, that you're too ambitious, too loud, too much. You'll be told to accept less, to be grateful for scraps, to make yourself smaller so other people are comfortable. She paused, letting the words settle. Don't listen. Be ungrateful. Be too much. Take up space. Build something that can't be taken away from you. The applause was thunderous. After the ceremony, Catherine found her in the crowd. They'd maintained a careful friendship over the years. Lillian had never fully trusted her motives, but she respected Catherine's competence. "Ashford died last month," Catherine said quietly. "Heart attack. He wanted you to know that what you built was better than any revenge he could have imagined." "I didn't build this for revenge." "I know. That's what made it better." Walking home that night through London's decorated streets, Lillian thought about the different versions of herself that had existed over the past 5 years. The desperate bride, the isolated prisoner, the runaway, the thief, the witness, the builder. All of them were real. All of them had been necessary. She'd never be the person she was before Adrian. That girl was gone, destroyed the night he walked out of their wedding chamber. But in her place was someone stronger, someone who'd learned that survival could transform into something that looked remarkably like triumph if you were stubborn enough. The apartment was dark when she arrived. Lillian lit lamps, put on tea, sat by the window watching snow start to fall. Somewhere out there, Adrian was building whatever life he could in America. Ashford was dead, his revenge achieved but ultimately hollow. The people who'd used her, manipulated her, tried to control her, all of them were gone or irrelevant. And she was here, building schools, publishing books, funding escape routes for women trapped in situations she understood too well. Not happy, exactly. Happiness seemed like too simple a word for what she felt, but alive, purposeful, free. The snow fell heavier, covering London in white, and Lillian Vance, not a duchess, not a victim, just herself, sat in her own home that she'd paid for with her own money that she'd fought for tooth and nail, and thought about all the women who'd walk through those school doors tomorrow. Women who'd learned that the life they'd been told to accept wasn't the only option, that they could choose, could leave, could build. She'd done that. Not perfectly, not without scars, but she'd done it. And tomorrow, she'd help someone else do the same. The letter from America arrived 6 months later. Lillian almost didn't open it. The handwriting was Adrian's, and she'd promised herself she was done with him. But curiosity won, one last time. "Lillian, I don't expect a response. You made it clear I have no claim on your time or attention, and I respect that. But there are things I need to say, even if you never read them. I'm teaching now. Mathematics at a small school in Boston. It's nothing glamorous, the pay is terrible, the students are difficult, the building is falling apart. But it's honest work. The first honest work I've done in 20 years. I read about the Foundation in an American newspaper. They reprinted one of your speeches, the one about being ungrateful and taking up space. I laughed until I cried, because that's exactly what you should have told me on our wedding night, instead of looking at me like I was something worth admiring. I destroyed myself trying to protect something that didn't deserve protection. You built yourself trying to protect people who deserved it. The contrast is not lost on me. This is the last time I'll contact you. You've made your position clear, and I understand it. But I wanted you to know that what you're doing, the schools, the legal clinics, all of it, is exactly what I should have used my resources for. Instead, I used them to hurt people and protect myself. If there's any meaning in what happened between us, maybe it's this. You learned what not to accept, and I learned what I actually am. Both of us are better for knowing the truth, even if the process of learning it nearly destroyed us both. I hope your life is everything you're building it to be. Adrian Lillian read the letter 3 times, then put it in a drawer with the journal Hartford had given her. Pieces of a story that was finished but not forgotten. She never wrote back. There was nothing left to say. Years passed. The foundation expanded to 12 schools, then 20. The publishing house became known for taking risks on unconventional voices. Lillian's name appeared in newspapers not as a scandal, but as an innovator, a philanthropist, someone who'd turned personal disaster into public good. She never remarried. Several men asked over the years, and she declined them all politely. Marriage felt like a door she'd closed permanently, and she had no interest in reopening it. Instead, she built networks, communities, systems that would outlast her. On the 10th anniversary of her wedding night, Lillian stood in front of the largest school the foundation had built, a proper campus with dormitories, laboratories, a library that would have made Adrian's collection look modest. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of people, including several members of parliament who'd supported the legislation allowing women to own property independently of their husbands. A journalist approached her after the speeches. "Mrs. Vance, people say your experience with the Duke of Blackthorn inspired all of this. Do you ever regret how things turned out?" Lillian looked at the school, at the girls already moving through its halls, at the physical manifestation of everything she'd fought for. "I regret that it was necessary," she said carefully. "I regret that women still need these protections, these escape routes, these support systems. But do I regret my choices? No. Every decision I made, every risk I took, all of it led here. And here is exactly where I need to be." "Do you consider yourself a success?" She thought about the question, about the girl who'd married a duke thinking it would save her, about the woman who'd broken into a castle to steal documents that would destroy him, about everything in between. "I consider myself alive," she said finally. "Everything else is just details." The journalist scribbled notes, looking disappointed that she hadn't given him the dramatic quote he wanted. But Lillian didn't care about drama anymore. She cared about results. That night, alone in her apartment with tea and the manuscript submissions that never stopped arriving, Lillian allowed herself to look back on the whole sprawling mess of the past decade. She'd survived abandonment, survived isolation and manipulation and danger, survived the loss of everything she'd thought she wanted, only to discover she'd wanted the wrong things entirely. And in surviving, she'd learned to build. Not perfectly, not without mistakes and missteps and moments of doubt that still woke her at 3 a.m. sometimes. But she'd built something real, something that would help women long after she was gone. That was enough. More than enough. Lillian Vance, not a duchess, never really a wife, just herself, closed the manuscript she'd been reading, marked it for publication, and looked out her window at the London night. Somewhere out there, girls were escaping situations that would have destroyed them. Women were starting businesses with foundation loans. Voices were being heard that had been silenced for generations. She'd done that. Not alone. There'd been help, allies, people who believed in the mission. But she'd started it, fought for it, refused to let it die even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The Duke of Blackthorn had tried to make her disappear into his world, into his story, into the role he'd assigned her. Instead, she'd disappeared on her own terms, and then she'd come back as something he could never have imagined. Something dangerous, something powerful, something free. The snow was falling again outside her window, and Lillian Vance smiled.